Okay, hi everybody. We're going to get started. So I'm very excited to have Kishen today. Kishen is a PhD student at the University of Maryland, where he's advised by Arvind Srinivasan and Lakshman Dhulipala. Kishen visited us last summer, so some of you already know him. Kishen has done very nice work in like clustering and graph algorithms, and in particular in work that sort of like lies at the intersection of theory and practice. So I think he has the unusual but nice sorts of abstracts where he talks about proving theoretical results, but then he also gets to talk about running these algorithms on graphs with like billions of nodes.
Yeah.
Trillions of edges, maybe.
Yeah, I guess that's good. Yeah.
And I guess we'll be talking about some of that today.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for the introduction, Alice. So I'll be talking about parallel algorithms for single linkage clustering. So yeah, this is joint work with my advisor Lakshman at the University of Maryland and Zhaojin and Yan from UC Riverside. So yeah, let's go. So single linkage clustering is a classic and perhaps a very natural, like greedy heuristic for computing like the clustering of data sets. So the idea behind it is like pretty simple. So you start with each of your data points as like its own like individual cluster, and iteratively you do the following. So you find the closest pair of clusters and merge them, right? And just repeat this for like the n-1 rounds until like every point is in the same cluster. And I guess that's the whole algorithm, right? And I guess like for single linkage clustering, so how do you define the distance between like two clusters? So it's basically defined as the minimum distance between any 2 points, pair of points from the two clusters, right? So in particular, single linkage clustering falls under this umbrella of like a more like generic greedy heuristics for clustering called hierarchical agglomerative clustering, also commonly known as HAC. So typically the different variants of HAC differ in like how you define this distance measure, or I guess the linkage criterion between two clusters. Okay, so I guess for this paper, like for this talk, we'll be just focusing on single linkage clustering. So yeah, let's say an example, and I guess the output of like all of these HAC algorithms and single linkage clustering is a sort of like a tree structure which denotes like the hierarchical clustering that we'll compute. So this output is constructed as follows. So you start by like merging the closest pair of clusters, and whenever you do that, you replace like I guess the two clusters with a single supercluster, I guess. And in the output, you introduce like an internal node whose children corresponds to the two clusters that merged to form it.
Maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but how is this different from minimum spanning tree?
Oh yeah, we'll get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, it turns out to be like equivalent, but yeah, we'll see. So yeah, I guess the clustering process like continues, and I guess the interesting case over here is like when the cluster containing like A, B, and C like merge. So in this case, you can see the internal node over here is denoted by AC. So I guess basically it's a pair of points corresponding to like the closest points that actually merged, right? So yeah, I hope that makes sense. So I guess like we continue with this process until like we get this entire tree structure. And so this output is called the dendrogram of the clustering. And I guess it's a very like useful structure to have. For instance, it denotes like the hierarchical clustering of the data, and which is typically required in a lot of applications. For instance, like from CompBio, where you want to study these phylogenetic trees, or like some sort of image analysis where you want to capture some sort of hierarchical concepts among your data, and many more. So I guess like for the rest of the talk, I guess I want you to just believe that it's kind of like an interesting and important question to study how to construct this output tree. Yeah, so I guess there is an alternate way to like view at the input. So instead of like considering just endpoints from some metric space, so there is this popular like idea of considering just some sort of like a graph representation of the of the data. So it could be like some sort of sparse representation of the similarity metric between the points. So typically here you're given like a graph on the data points where you have m edges, and you can think of the non-edges as sort of like the irrelevant kind of like pairs in your data, or in other terms, like you can think of the distance between these 2 points to be like very large. So you never actually consider these pairs during your clustering process. And I guess you can construct the clustering like in a similar form, but now the viewpoint is just nicer in the sense that these internal nodes like correspond to edges in your graph, right? And so now is the exercise part of the talk. So, and I guess like Phil already mentioned. So I guess like it turns out like not all of these edges are actually useful for single linkage clustering, right? So all you care about are the edges corresponding to these internal nodes. So can I guess, and it turns out like, yeah, these edges are just the minimum span edges of the minimum spanning tree. And yeah, this is like well known. And I guess you can think of the intuition as it's basically Kruskal's algorithm, right? So so single linkage clustering is basically like processing edges in like the sorted order of weights, and you keep merging things unless it doesn't form a cycle. So it's the exact same thing. I guess the only difference here is what we want as a final output is the dendrogram that we talked about. So I guess it's nice in the sense that you can now view the problem as you can basically break down the problem as 2 steps. First, given like your data set, you can compute the minimum spanning tree over that data set. And once you have the minimum spanning tree, now the question is, given this tree, can I compute the dendrogram like efficiently? Right? So yeah, like is the problem and like I guess everything clear so far? Any questions? I guess there is some sort of like consistent tie breaking. So I guess, yeah, we can just assume like the weights are unique for now. Yeah. Cool. So we'll be talking about parallel algorithms for this problem. So I'd like to like define the theoretical framework under which we will study these algorithms. So we will like study all of these algorithms under the like popular work depth model, which is like a shared memory model. And I guess you can think of, so let's say if you're given some algorithm, you can view it as some sort of like a set of operations which correspond, for which you can like construct some sort of like a computation graph where each vertex corresponds to some operation performed by the algorithm. And I guess edges over here or directed edges over here determine like if there's a dependency between these operations, right? So any algorithm, I guess you can like represent it now in the form of a DAG. And we define like the work of the algorithm to basically be the number of vertices in the computational DAG, right? So it's the overall number of operations performed by the algorithm. Or another way to view it is if you have just a single processor and you're running the algorithm sequentially, so that's running time, right? And then there is this notion of depth, which is basically defined as the longest sequence of I guess sequence of dependent operations, or this longest I guess the longest directed path in this computation DAG, right? Or I guess the viewpoint over here is that, let's say if you're given like even an infinite number of processors, this is like the parallel run, this is like the overall running time of the algorithm, right? And it turns out that using like something like Brent's theorem for like scheduling these computational DAGs, typically the running time of your algorithm is something like the work of the algorithm divided by the number of processors plus the big O of the depth, right? And this can actually be achieved using what is known as like work efficient schedulers. So you can like schedule, for instance, like a given like parallel algorithm with certain work and depth in this running time, right? With high probability, but yeah. And I guess given this viewpoint, like our goal is typically to design what is known as like a work efficient algorithm, where you want the work of your like parallel algorithm to be like asymptotically equivalent to the work of the best known sequential algorithm. And you want the algorithm to have low depth. And typically we're looking at like something like polylog in the input size. And so that's a model. So now going back to the question, so this is the problem we are trying to solve. So we're given a tree as an input, and you want another tree, which is a single linkage dendrogram. So how do you solve this problem like sequentially? So for this, I guess it's pretty easy. You just follow the original description of the algorithm, or like which is basically Kruskal's algorithm, right? So the idea here being you first sort the edges by weight and process them one by one, and you can use like a union find data structure to maintain like the clusters and update like the parent pointers, right? So the overall like running time of this algorithm is basically the n log n for sorting and n times alpha of n for for processing the edges, where alpha is the inverse Ackermann function. And I guess in the work depth viewpoint that I mentioned, which I'll continue from now on. So this is the work of the algorithm, and it turns out that this algorithm is like pretty fast. So especially given that it is a very simple algorithm, and for instance, you can use like a very fast and efficient like parallel sorting algorithm. So the depth of the algorithm is essentially this term, and it turns out to do like really well in practice. And I think like if anyone in practice is using single linkage clustering, they use this algorithm because it's like pretty hard to beat.
So theoretically, I mean, this presumably this is not work efficient in the sense that the sequential algorithm is probably is linear or linear times alpha.
Actually, you cannot do better than n log n, in the sense that it's kind of like sorting, right? So you can get like sorting based lower bounds for the problem. So, or I guess like for instance, yeah, I guess, yeah. For a very simple like example would be like, let's say if you have a star, and yeah, with the edge weight, so that would solve sorting, right? Yeah. So I guess now the question is, do we have like parallel algorithms for this? And it turns out, yeah, there is like a very classic problem, like algorithm called nearest neighbor chain. I won't go into the details of this algorithm, but it's a pretty like simple idea. So basically, in this algorithm like proceeds in rounds, where in each round you associate like each like active cluster to its nearest neighbor, its closest cluster. And let's say associate means, let's say you're adding a directed edge, right? So this would give like some sort of like a DAG, except it ends at some sort of a reciprocal pair, right? So there would always be two clusters which prefer each other, right? So the idea here is that you can always like merge reciprocal pairs independently. So they are like safe to merge, right? So given this, like it's I guess it's not too hard to see that you can actually implement this algorithm in work which is big O of n log h, which is like an output sensitive bound, and where h is the height of the output dendrogram, right? And typically h is in the range of log n to n. So in certain regimes, it's better than the previous algorithm. And the depth of this algorithm is actually proportional to the height of the dendrogram. So it's not, it's nice, but it's still like not polylog, which we were hoping for, right? Yeah.
The bound on the depth here, though, maybe works for a single, right?
Yes. Yeah. Just for single linkage.
And why are you losing a node in the depth? Like, why is it here?
Good question. I think it's something like h log n. Maybe there's a way to implement it in like h plus log n, but yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly, but I remember like thinking about it, but it seems like I always ended up having an extra log n factor. Yeah. Cool.
This may be aside from you. Has there been any work on the on computing this even sequentially when you assume that the proximity, the distances, I'm comfortable calling them distances because they don't satisfy trying to but the pairwise distances are integers that are not too big? Because then
I guess in that case, you can actually solve it in linear time, right? For instance, sorting is linear time on integer weights, and then you can also do this, I guess, this union find procedure. Like, I think there was this paper where if you have like all of these like merges beforehand, which we do have, right? So you can actually implement that in linear time. I think that's true. Yeah.
So is there a parallel algorithm that achieves similar work?
Good question. I don't think so. Yeah, not yet.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
that'd be an interesting.
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
mean, maybe it does better,
Mhm.
with some slight error.
True. True. Yeah. Interesting. Cool. So yeah, so I guess like nearest neighbor chain, like as Alice was pointing out, it's a very generic algorithm in the sense that you can use it to like implement various other like linkage criterion. I think the only requirement is that it has to be a monotone linkage criterion, I guess. But it turns out like for single linkage, it's like not fast enough, especially when you're trying to beat like a very fast sequential baseline. And there are like adversarial inputs where it could be very bad because the height of the dendrogram can be very high, right? So is the problem in NC? Yes, it is. So so there was a Sigma 21 paper which gives this very nice top-down approach, and I would like to describe this algorithm because it kind of also gives like a nice understanding of how these single linkage dendrograms actually look, right? So the idea for the algorithm was as follows. So if you look at if you look at the top like heaviest n over 2 edges, so you know that these n over 2 edges are the ones which merge at the end, right? So in that sense, when you actually look at their corresponding positions in the dendrogram, so they have to somehow like form some sort of like a prefix of the tree, right? So as seen in this figure, right? So they always end up forming like this sort of like a prefix of the tree. So given this, the idea is as follows. So you compute this subtree just on these edges. And I guess like how do you compute them? You can think of like contracting everything, every other edges of like weight smaller than it until you just end up with these like n by 2 heavy edges. And once you have the subtree, recursively compute the dendrogram of it. And that gives you the top part of your dendrogram. And then I guess if you think about it, it's not too hard to see that if you look at the, I guess the subtrees between these heavy edges, they would basically correspond in the dendrogram, basically they would hang out of like one of these nodes, right? So the idea here now is to just recursively also like solve the problem on all of these small subtrees. So they have to be connected. So solve the problem on these connected subtrees, and yeah, I guess like just hang them off those. So I guess like conceptually it sounds like a very easy idea, and you can actually I guess it's not too hard to see that the work should be n log n because you're dividing into sub problems of size at most n over 2, and it can be implemented in depth log square and log n. And the idea here is I think like the bottleneck of this algorithm is finding these subtrees, right? And for this, the authors basically use a nice like Euler-Tour tree kind of a data structure. And it turns out like this kind of process that they do is like, it's a pretty complex process for actually computing these subtrees using the Euler-Tour tree. So turns out not being very practical. So even in the experiments that they had in the paper, so they use a dendrogram as sort of like a subroutine in some other clustering algorithm. And they ended up using the sequential baseline again. Right? So, okay, so given this, so then now there are like two questions. So can we actually get like a work efficient algorithm? And here, I guess I'm defining like work efficient to basically have work n log h, because that's kind of a stronger bound, or it's more like output sensitive, I guess. And can we design an algorithm which is practical, which basically gives like non-trivial like speed ups over the sequential baseline. And in our work, we affirmatively answer like both these questions, but using different algorithms. Right? So yeah, so I guess in our work, we give like first this algorithm called SLD tree contraction. And as the name says, so I guess SLD stands for single linkage dendrogram. So we use a tree contraction algorithm for kind of like defining some sort of like a divide and conquer approach. So I'll talk about it in some time. And the work of this algorithm is like n log h, and the depth is like polylog. But it turns out that it's a pretty complex algorithm requiring like some sort of like heavy data structures. So you require like some sort of meldable heaps with like certain other properties, which doesn't make it very practical. But there is like a lazy implementation of this algorithm, which leads to a very fast algorithm in practice. So we call this algorithm RC tree tracing. I guess the name will make sense later on. And this algorithm has work n log n and depth log square n, and it's very simple and gives like incredible speedups on like and consistent speedups in a lot of the data sets. Yeah.
Just to give an idea, how big is a typical data set here?
So I guess we look at three ranges. So starting from the million to the billion scale, and I guess we end up getting like 150x speed up over the sequential thing. Yeah.
Can you just remind me the depth of the previous n log n algorithm was from one log or something?
Yeah, it had a log. Yeah, it was log square n, log n.
This is like form.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. So we also give like a sort of like an asynchronous and like optimized implementation of the nearest neighbor chain algorithm that I talked about. So I won't be talking about this algorithm, but basically I'm just so that's also going to be like one of our baselines in our experiments. But yeah, I guess like so now I'll give like a brief overview of the techniques like in our paper. And the most important ingredient of our like algorithms is this merge subroutine, which we call like SLD merge, which basically gives an efficient way to merge the dendrograms of two subtrees under certain assumptions. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And given this sort of like a merge subroutine, I guess you can think the goal is to define like design like a divide and conquer algorithm. And I guess it's pretty hard to actually so I guess it's a non-trivial problem to design like decide like how do you decompose your graph into like smaller subproblems, right? So for this we use parallel tree contraction. We tried like other tree decomposition methods, but turns out this was the only one which gave us like optimal like work bounds. I think, for instance, like we used heavy light decomposition, which gave something like n log square h, something like that. But yeah, so these are like the two main ingredients, and I'm going to talk about these two. So before I go ahead, like any questions? Awesome. Yeah. So I'll first talk about the merge subroutine. So the goal over here, or I guess the assumption that I mentioned before. So you're given a tree, and let's say we are allowed to split the tree at a vertex. And you can think of the split as like creating a copy of that vertex to both the halves, but we are not going to share edges between the two halves, right? So we are going to like divide the edges between the two. And the idea is, let's say if we actually recursively compute the dendrogram for both sides, so how do we merge them, right? So I guess like trying to study like this example, just like one observation over here. It turns out that not a lot of the structure in the output dendrogram changes when we merge the two, or like when you compute the dendrogram for the entire tree. Right? In particular, the nodes marked in blue are basically the parts that do not change at all, and the nodes marked in red are the ones which change. Right? I mean, yeah, most of the red nodes. And I guess I want to highlight over here like the idea. The idea is that we want to show the things that actually change when we merge the two dendrograms are just going to be nodes along a certain like node to root path. So it's always going to be on some path in the output. Yeah.
The root is the node that you're splitting on, or
It's the root of the dendrogram. Yeah. So we can split at any vertex, but as long as we make sure that we do not share edges between the two sides. Yeah.
And what does it mean to change here? You just mean that the parent.
Yes. So that's a basic change. So basically the parent pointers, I guess.
Why is
It's actually not changing, but I guess I just kept it that way to show. I guess what I want to show is that like it's always going to be some node to root path. In this example, it doesn't change, but yeah.
Subset of some.
Yes. That's more precise actually. Yeah. Awesome. So I guess to get a better understanding, let's look at a more simpler case. So let's say our input is actually a path graph, right? So we're given this path graph, and this is the output dendrogram for it. So I guess like for paths, let's try to like see how the dendrogram is, how the dendrogram looks, right? So the root of your dendrogram is always going to be the edge corresponding to the highest weight, right? So in this case, it's edge ij with weight 11. And when you do that, so I guess you kind of like split the two sides of the paths, the two sides of the path, like because I guess like things on the left cannot interact with the things on the right because it has to go through the edge ij, but that's the one which merges at the last. So you can think of this as if you place ij as a root, you can just decompose it into two parts and recursively compute the dendrogram on both sides, right? And so on. So basically, the root is the highest weight edge, and its left child is basically the highest weight edge on the left. Its right child is the highest weight edge on the right. And this continues as follows. So this, I guess this structure or this property kind of like resembles another problem, a well-studied problem called Cartesian trees. Anyone knows Cartesian trees or seen Cartesian trees before? Oh, awesome. But yeah, the idea of Cartesian tree is the same as what I was describing. So it's a very like useful data structure. So the idea is like you're given an array of numbers or integers as an input, and the Cartesian tree for that array is defined as you take the highest number in the array to be the root, and its left child is defined as the highest number to its left, and the right child is defined as the highest number to the right. And then you recursively do this, and you get this nice tree structure. And I guess like Cartesian trees have like very nice applications, for instance, for solving like range minimum queries, and also like for computing suffix arrays and so on. Like it's a very well-studied data structure. And I guess this is what I wanted to establish, is that single linkage dendrogram on path graphs is basically equivalent to the problem of solving Cartesian trees on arrays, in particular the array of the edge weights, right? So this is nice. So in the sense that we can kind of like try to adapt some approaches from the Cartesian tree literature. And in particular, we look at this parallel algorithm for constructing Cartesian trees by Julian Schön and Guy Blalock. So their algorithm is again like a divide and conquer based algorithm. And I guess I'll describe the algorithm, but in context of our single linkage clustering problem. And I guess the idea again, like as I mentioned, is this. So the only nodes affected when we merge two dendrograms are going to be like some subset of the nodes in some node to root path, right? So I guess I'll use the term spine for, so whenever I talk about some node to root path, right? So yeah, let's say this is the input, and we decide to split the path at vertex G, right? And given this, so we create copies of G as mentioned before. And let's say we recursively computed the dendrograms, right? So now I want to merge them. So when I actually add things back, so what are the clusterings that are actually affected? So firstly, everything involving vertex G, right? So I guess like, yeah, every like clustering on either side which involve vertex G is kind of like affected by this, right? So you kind of need to redo things for that. So let's say we remove all of those clusters, right? And now we want to sort of like rebuild things. So before we go ahead, like one thing I want to like, I guess the goal is to give an intuition here, is that everything else, so basically all the other like merges that have happened over here, so which are not involving vertex G, my claim is that they are not really affected. I guess in this, for instance, in the path case, it's like easy to see in the sense that I guess like this segment doesn't really like merge with anything to the right unless like the edge DE merges, right? So they're kind of like bound in a sense, and they're bound by the clusterings corresponding to the the clusters containing like vertex G, right? So yeah, so basically we don't really change like anything corresponding to this clustering of this segment, which basically is the subtree over here. And similarly, those segments which correspond to the subtrees rooted at KL and HI, right? So the only things that change are actually the nodes along the spine of FG and GH, right? And now how does a merge happen? So first we merge like the edge FG. And once FG is merged, so the next merge that happens is GH. So I guess, so here the pointer of FG changes. So now it actually points to GH. And this process continues. So, yeah. Cool. So, I guess like one more thing is, okay, maybe I try to give an intuition here. So when we redo this clustering, so it turns out that when we look at these two spines, right, or these node to root paths, so when we're actually like recomputing the pointers, it turns out that they have to appear in some sort of like sequential order. And why is that the case? I guess the idea here is all of these clusterings involve vertex G, right? So since they are like some sort of like merges involving a particular vertex, they all have to happen like one after the other, right? So in a sense, we are kind of like taking these two spines and we are kind of interleaving them now. Right? I hope, is that intuition like clear? Yeah. So they all have to happen like sequentially in some order, and that order has to be the sorted weight because single linkage clustering proceeds in that order, right? So that's the overall algorithm. So you look at, you recursively compute the dendrograms, identify the two spines, and those spines are basically the spines of the two edges incident to vertex G. And just look at those spines and now interleave them, basically sorting them based on their edge weights, and then assign the pointers, right? Yeah.
So I was just trying to ask if you can just state the merge process more formally. Like you're
Okay.
just going bottom up from these two spines, and
Right.
you have two current node, and then one of them will become the parent of the other, depending on whose weight is.
Right. Perfect. Yeah. I guess that's what's happening here. So you start at the bottom of these two spines, and I guess you compare those two. And so among those two, the weight of FG is like smaller. So I guess now that points to something. And what does it point to? So it should either point to either EF as before or GH. And in this case, it turns out it has to point to GH, right? And once you do that, FG is done, and you look at the next node in the spine, which is EF, and now do the same comparison. So yeah, it's sort of like just walking along the spines and moving parent pointers, depending on by comparing the edge weights. Yes.
So yeah, I think I answered my question, but maybe I'll say my thought out loud. So I guess like if every merge involves G, I was wondering why this counts as any progress. I guess the point is that like when you say like literally just sort of like running, like you have these two pointers and you just keep taking one to figure out how to figure it up.
Right.
So you don't have to like actually resolve the entire problem of the
True. Yes.
It's a much easier problem.
Yes, that's correct. So yeah, actually you don't need to like solve as you said, you don't need to restart like the clustering process again involving G. So it's basically just look at all the merges and sort them by weights. Yeah.
Are we then GH ends up pointing to EF, so are we comparing like the parent GH and like how do
And
you
EF.
really know which is the next thing? I guess the old parent of the one that was.
Oh yeah, so I guess we kind of like maintain what's the current node on both the trees.
And then when
Yeah.
you point from GH to EF, there's still a pointer to IJ, but is that just supposed to have?
Yeah, I guess yeah, that has to be removed. Oh yeah, I didn't remove it. Okay, yeah. Cool.
So
Thanks, sir.
when you change the parent pointer of FG to GH, you know GH is smaller than EF. So GH is the next node you should handle. But which node you attach GH to depends on whether EF or IJ is smaller.
So yeah, that's the algorithm for paths. Oh yeah, sorry.
is it possible to merge many trees instead? Because
Mhm.
I guess the depth bottleneck is in this case, like when we merge the last two trees, they will have the largest depth, so it's the depth bottleneck. So
Oh yeah, so I'm still like not talking about like how do we do this in parallel. I guess we'll get to that, but so you're talking about the running time of this, right? Or
yeah,
is that- yeah.
I guess it's the depth.
Yeah, so basically it should be the length of the spine, which I guess is bounded by the height of the output dendrogram. But that's if you're doing this sequentially, but you can do something different when you're doing it in parallel. So we'll see that in a minute. So I guess I just want to give the intuition now as to how to extend the idea from paths to trees. And it's the exact same idea. So let's say you compute the dendrogram. You split the tree at a certain vertex, compute the dendrogram, and now you're just trying to merge. So basically look at all clusterings involving that common vertex, and let's say if you undo them, and though all of those have to, since it involves the same vertex, it has to appear in like some sort of sequential order in the output. So I guess now all you need to do is just redo like all of them. And I guess in the path case, it was easy. So there was exactly one edge incident to the common vertex. But if it's like a general tree and there are like multiple edges incident to the vertex, so one thing you do know is that if you take the smaller weight edge, so the higher weight edges have to have to lie along this node to root path, right, involving that vertex. So you can always like think of just picking the minimum weight edge and looking at its spine, and so you get like two spines from the two trees, and then again just doing the merge. So I guess that's the main idea for extending it to trees. So nice. So we have this merge subroutine. So now I guess it enables like divide and conquer algorithms. But how do we decompose our problem into smaller subproblems? And so we'll use like parallel tree contraction. So I guess I'll define like tree contraction. So the idea of tree contraction is basically another like clustering procedure where you starting with like an input tree, you basically proceed by doing two types of operations. So first thing is a rake, which basically removes degree 1 vertices. And by remove, I mean you can think of merging that degree 1 vertex with its neighbor, right? And the second thing is a compress, where you look at degree 2 vertices and you basically, I guess, merge with one of the neighbors of it, right? So you kind of like remove your degree 2 vertices, but now make its two neighbors, just add an edge between its two neighbors, right? So I guess if you repeat this process like sequentially, that's in linear time. But if you want to do this in parallel, I guess this is another exercise. So it turns out that it's always sufficient to just, instead of like removing all degree 2 nodes at any particular instant, even if you pick like some independent set, some maximal independent set of degree 2 nodes and compress them and compress all the degree 1 nodes, because it's easy to handle degree 1 nodes, right? But the difficulty is in handling like degree 2 nodes, because you can have like conflicts, especially if there are 2 degree 2 nodes which are neighbors, right? So which one to merge into what? So the idea is you find a maximal independent set of degree 2 nodes and perform compress. And it turns out that if you do like repeat this process in like rounds of rakes and compresses, it clusters the entire tree in log n rounds. And yeah, so that's parallel tree contraction. And I guess another way to view it is it basically induces some sort of like a hierarchical decomposition or clustering of the trees, of the input tree. Yes.
When you're doing compress on a maximum input set, are you always merging into the lower weight neighbor?
That's what we're going to do, but it's not necessary like in general.
Yeah.
Right.
But
So
for your
yes, yeah, that's what we're going to do. Yeah. But in general, like tree contraction doesn't really require us to look at the weights of the edges. So this is an example. So maybe this. So you start with like rakes. So I guess you can do all of these rakes in parallel. And the second thing is we're doing compresses. So we are compressing, I guess, the vertex C and F, right? And finally, another set of rakes and one final rake, right? So the idea here is now to treat like rakes and compressors as basically it's like the merging of two subtrees along a particular edge, right? So I guess we're merging the subtrees, and at the same time we also merge the dendrograms of the subtrees, right? So this is an example of a rake. So so here we have like the subtree corresponding to an intermediate like cluster during tree contraction C and E, and C is like the degree 1 cluster now, and I guess GC is like the subtree corresponding to the cluster C, and GE is a cluster induced on the vertices present in cluster E, right? And they're joined by this edge CE. So I guess like you can view this merge as a two-step process, where first you add the edge CE to the subtree on like cluster C, right? So you can basically treat the edge CE as its own subtree and GC and merge those two while merging the dendrograms. So and once you do that, so I guess yeah, for the first merge, the common vertex is vertex C, and once we have that, now we'll merge like this sort of like intermediate dendrogram with the dendrogram of GE, right? And there the common vertex is vertex C. So now the question is, yeah, how do we merge dendrograms quickly in parallel? So the first idea here is, maybe one thing I would like to point out here is that, so when we're actually doing the merges over here, so for the first merge, we require like the spine corresponding to edge BC, right, for the merge, and the spine corresponding to edge CE, which is a singleton set, which is fine. But once we are done with that, for the second merge, we need the spine corresponding to the min weight edge incident to E, which in this case it is edge EF, right? And that merges with the spine corresponding to CE. So how do we get access to all of these spines? So I guess if we want like random access to all of these spines, we have to end up using some sort of linked list kind of a structure, which is not good for parallelism. So I guess that's what motivates the first thing. So it turns out that whenever we are performing rakes and compressors, we actually don't need to store like or require access to all the spines of that subtree, and all we need is just one particular spine. So to prove this, I guess think of the case where in tree contraction we are just doing rakes, right? So if you're doing just rakes, all of the edges that are present in the tree at any point in time are just incident to a single vertex in a particular cluster, because we always keep raking things into a particular cluster. So every active edge should be incident to only that vertex, right? So in that sense, like whenever we need to merge something with that cluster, we just require the spine corresponding to the min weight edge incident to that vertex, right? So it's kind of easy to see how that works for only rakes. But compress is tricky. And I guess the idea here is we maintain this invariant that LS mentioned. So you always compress via the smaller weightage, right? So let's see like an intuition as to why this works. So let's say we have a cluster C, which we are going to compress, and the edge with weight L is smaller than the edge with weight H. So we prove this by induction. So let's say initially cluster C was not involved in any compress operation, right? So only rakes happened, or it's just a single vertex. So in that case, the argument that I mentioned before should work, in the sense that both edges L and H are incident to the same vertex in C, right? Hence, all we need is so for any future merge, like after merging, like after like I guess compressing C into A, right? Let's say. So any future merge would require basically the spine corresponding to the min weight edge in cluster A, and it also requires like the spine of L, right? But since L and H are incident to the same vertex, so I guess the spine of E star over here, so E star is the smallest weight edge incident to A. So that would include L at some point in its like node to root path. I guess that's an intuition. So we do have access to spine of L, and we also do have access to the min weight edge incident to the left, right? And the inductive case like proceeds as follows. So It's time do I have left? Okay. Yeah. So in the inductive case, so let's say we so far like have a spine. We are storing a single spine like corresponding to cluster C, which contains like all the required like I guess like contains the required spine required for the merges on like left and right. And now let's say we are merging along this edge L, right? So in a future merge, we would actually like merge the cluster containing C with B, right? For that merge, we would require like I guess like how do you say that? Yeah, you would require like the spine of the smallest like weight edge incident to H, or the vertex corresponding to H. But we know by induction that we do have a spine which has that information. And now we are adding the edge L, right? And since L has like weight smaller than H, so it's I guess like whenever the spine of H merges with the spine of L, it would always like go at some point, like it will merge into some point like higher than L. Right? So I guess that's the intuition. Yeah, I hope that it's kind of like a messy intuition, but I hope that makes sense. Any questions so far? So yeah, so first, yeah, we determined that all we need is a single spine. And the second idea is to basically not do the mergers like eagerly. So let's say that we maintain the, so since we are always maintaining a single spine, which is a sequential set of things which are of sorted weights, or in like non-decreasing weights. So we can, instead of storing them sequentially, we can just store them in some sort of like an ordered data structure, if for instance in a heap, right? I guess like whenever we are doing merges, so merging two heaps is basically a meld operation which can be done in like of log n time. But since the size of the heaps are, since the heaps are basically storing some particular spine, the number of elements in the heap is always bounded by the height of the dendrogram, right? So it's overall like log h, yes. And the second operation that we would require is whenever we add like an edge to, whenever a compress or a rake happens, so we kind of like add that edge to that particular spine. And we know that, so one observation is that everything below that, that means that any edge whose weight is smaller than that edge, so those are kind of like protected from any future merges, because any future merge has to happen like through this edge E, and everything below it is like of weight smaller, so it can't really interfere with those. So I guess the idea here is that whenever we actually add edge E to the spine, we look at all nodes whose weights are like smaller than it, remove those, and since we know they are like part of a contiguous spine, just update the parent pointers at that time, right? And so this operation can be performed by like a variant of like binomial heaps, do it in like low depth. So yeah, this is the overall algorithm and the running time. And I guess, yeah, the bottleneck is in maintaining the heaps and deleting nodes. So how do we, in terms of like getting a practical algorithm? So we get around that by basically using these two observations. So if we look at the tree contraction process that we were seeing, so whenever an edge is like so an edge is like introduced into some spine only when it contracts, right? So that's the first observation. Before that, it's not present in any of the spines, right? And once it is introduced, it remains in a spine until some other like edge whose weight is greater than it comes and like removes it from the heap, right? Using in what I described before. So given these two observations, we can actually identify, we can actually do this process in a different way now. So we construct something called as a rake compressed tree, or RC tree. So this structure would be, I guess, like slightly different to what like the commonly well-known like RC tree structures. But the idea here is each node of your RC tree is basically corresponding to the edge corresponding to the contraction, the compress or the rake. And that particular edge basically points to the cluster it merges into, right? So you get this sort of like a tree structure now. And I guess compressed still has to maintain the invariant that it always merges into the smaller weight incident edge. So once you're given this RC tree, so we basically do the tree contraction process, but don't do anything about the single linkage, don't do anything about the dendrograms. So we have like this tree contraction process represented using this RC tree. And now the idea is you look at the node corresponding to each edge key. So that node is a point at which it was introduced in our algorithm inside some spine. And then it was involved in every merge until it was removed by some edge. And that should be an edge whose weight is like greater than it. So it's basically, as you keep like walking along this path, corresponding to like contractions involving that edge, until you find some edge node corresponding to whose weight is like greater than it, right? And at that point, it's removed. So I guess, so the idea is now for each edge, you can like identify all of these, to identify the point at which it is removed. And let's say you introduce it, you maintain for each node like the bucket of edges that actually get removed at that point, right? So given these buckets, I guess these edges correspond exactly to the I guess nodes that were kind of like filtered out in the from the heap that we talked about before, right? And I guess we can just do the same thing as before, sort and assign the parent pointers. I know I went through this like very quickly, but it turns out this algorithm is like pretty fast in practice. It doesn't require us to use heaps anymore, and yeah, it's pretty simple. And these are like the few like experimental results that we have. So we look at different types of graphs and like also like edge, I guess ways of assigning the edge weights. And we typically just assign like some sort of permutation on the edges. And it turns out we get like up from 2 to at least like 132x speed up using our RCT tracing algorithm. And there's another baseline that we use, which is like a very optimized implementation of the nearest neighbor chain, which also gets good speed up in general, but there are like adversarial cases where it fails very badly. So, oh yeah, so we implemented all of this in C++, and it's a 92 core machine with hyperthreading, and it's a shared memory system.
Are there benchmarks from the biology? literature?
I'm not aware of like open source. Yeah. I guess the biology stuff, yeah. Yeah, I guess I'm out of time, so I'll skip the open problems part. So yeah, thank you again for listening to my talk. Yes.
I'm a little bit puzzled about this desire to avoid heaps. Is it that sort of hard to implement nowadays, or is it that you don't actually need all the generality of the heaps because this RCT structure sort of says that you don't actually have to order the removals depending on their batch?
Right. So I guess that kind of like helps in the sense that there's a lot of locality now. And so the kind of like heap data structure we require like for the mergers requires us to answer this sort of like a query. I guess. Yeah, so this last point, which I didn't really describe it clearly, but basically you have like a bunch of items in your heap, and at some point you introduce like some item, and when you do that, you want to kind of like filter out everything which is smaller than it, and you want to do that in parallel. So it's sort of like a batch deletion in a heap, which is like pretty hard to do, like binomial. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yes, and it turns out that, okay, for instance, binary search trees are good for that, but then they're not good for merging. Right, so the merge time is proportional to the size. Yeah. Oh no, it's not that. Yeah. Yes, that's true. And yes. And yeah. Okay.
You are. Okay.